Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We've said now a few times that this week we begin Exodus, Parshat Shemot, and this parsha is kind of like a coda to the stories of Genesis. This parsha and the parshiot that come next, because they are also narrative. In these first 6 chapters, we read much of the early plot of a familiar narrative, as we'll do in the coming weeks, before moving into a lengthy list of laws. And in this week's narrative, it's very familiar stuff. A new Pharaoh rises over Egypt who enslaves the Israelite people. We read of Moses' birth and redemption at the hands of Pharaoh's daughter, which we'll also, can keep thinking about for the rest of today. And we get a narrative arc that extends from Moses killing an Egyptian, fleeing to Midian, and encountering the burning bush, all the way to returning to Egypt to intercede with Pharaoh on his people's behalf, which we just read, or we read the last part of it. And this is actually where we find Moses throughout this entire book of Exodus, and indeed the rest of the Torah, leading the Israelites from slavery to freedom, and then for 40 years in the wilderness. But despite the way that we tend to think of Moses as Moshe Rabbeinu, our great teacher, imagined by Cecil B. DeMille and Michelangelo as a man of great stature, many of us know that that's not really how he comes across in the Torah, certainly not in this parsha, and also, as I hinted, not even in those 3 verses that we chanted a moment ago. When God tells Moses that he is to lead his people out of Egyptian bondage, he responds with the famous words, Mi Anochi, which literally translates to who, me? In an instant, we get a glimpse of Moses as a different kind of Jewish archetype filled with neurotic energy, questions, and doubt. And Moses doesn't stop here. For the better part of the next chapter, they go on like this, with God telling Moses to go redeem his people, and Moses saying, Shlach na biyad tishlach, please send somebody else. Our rabbis like to imagine Moses, especially in this moment, as a paragon of anavut, of humility. And indeed, the book of Numbers tells us he was the most humble man in all the world. But I don't think that this parsha presents humility so much as anxiety. Moses specifically comes to God in this episode and says, but I am not an ish devarim, I am not a man of words. How can I lead this people? Moses doubts his qualifications and maybe doubts his own self-worth. If humility is the ability to see yourself exactly as you are, no better and no worse, then this is not what Moses exemplifies here. Instead, it seems to me like he's expressing shame in human imperfections and his insecurity about leadership. What's really interesting here, though, is not just Moses' expression of shame, but God's reaction to it. When Moses asks, who am I? Scholar Dina Weiss points out that God doesn't respond by saying, you're Moses, you saved an Israelite from being beaten, who protected Yitro's daughters from attack, who talks directly with the divine. God doesn't say any of that. All God says is that God will be there with him when he goes back to Egypt. You can understand how Moses might have been disappointed here. God falls short of extolling his virtues, though it sounds like that might have been what would have calmed him down in the moment. The Midrash tells us that God spoke to Moses in the voice of Moses' father, Amram. But God never offers Moses the sort of fatherly advice we might expect. God never says, you can do it, you're a champ, I believe in you. What God does say is more cryptic, but in the long run, it might be more meaningful. Ehya imach, I will be with you. I will be your voice when you feel voiceless, over and over again, until it finally breaks through to Moses, and he is able to be the leader of his people, the leader that they need him to be. On the one hand, of course, we could learn from this that we need to work through our shame and self-doubt in order to achieve our maximum potential. After all, so many of us get bogged down by self-doubt and shame and wind up not fulfilling our aspirations, and all of that is true. But the truth is further that moving out of shame can take a lifetime of work. And I think a more useful lesson for us is found in God's behavior here as the interlocutor. Many of us find ourselves in this position with the people in our lives when people express self-doubt or shame. And sometimes we don't really know what to say other than reassuring with kind words. But the point here is that words of affirmation mean less than simply remaining present and not running away. You can imagine that Moses was just as insecure talking to Pharaoh as he was when he first spoke of it with God. But he had with him in that moment a rod, which was a symbol, a reminder that God was with him. To be sure, it's easy to feel confident when your partner is literally omnipotent, but it's the feeling of God's presence, maybe even more than God's power, that ultimately allows Moses to achieve his potential. It's that idea that God is with him more than the fact that God is omnipotent. As we now barrel ahead toward a secular new year, there are plenty of reasons to be insecure, personally and professionally for many of us, but also, as we know, more globally, as we confront more variants of COVID-19 and further questions about how we'll get out of this mess. And my prayer for us entering 2022 is that amidst the anxieties and sorrows that we feel now and likely will feel for some time, that we find people who can be present with us. And so too, may we likewise find ways to be there for those in our lives who need us in working through their self-doubt and achieving their potential. This time is really challenging. It has been challenging, and seemingly these days, we're surprised by how challenging it continues to be. But it may be that presence, our presence, more than our power, is the thing that will get us through this time. Shabbat Shalom.